Buenas noches. En primer lugar,
Good evening. First of all, I would like to thank the Juan de Mariana Institute for this enormous distinction. A year ago, due to these issues of the campaigns and so on, my sister and I had to come to Madrid. By chance, or by the forces of heaven, or by spontaneous order, I was put in contact with Manuel Lamas, and because of his responsibility,
me llevaron a ponerme en contacto con Manuel Llamas.
I had the honor of coming to the dinner where Dr. Enzo Bastos was awarded, whom I admire so much, like so many others whom I will mention. I was also lucky that Murray Rothbard was my table that day. Today I think it was more than a coincidence, because, in fact, thanks to reading Murray Rothbard's article, Monopoly and Competition, I converted to the Austrian school.
A leer el artículo de Murray Rothbard, Monopolio y Competencia, yo me convertí a la escuela austríaca.
In an edition published by Libertas, which had been translated by the father of our hero of freedom and, clearly, one of my mentors, Dr. Alberto Venegas Lynch, son, to whom I owe so much and to whom I am so grateful for everything he has taught and for his generosity towards me. Also, in a rather hostile context in which I was developing my presence in liberalism and politics. And in that context, I also want to thank Professor Huerta de Soto for his words. He has been so important in inspiring us all, where his classes on YouTube are a true revolution. I also want to thank Professor Ricardo Manuel Rojas for his words, who in some parts, now when I speak, I will mention, he has always been so generous with me and on several occasions he has helped me a lot. I also want to thank Gabriel Calzada. I had the opportunity to meet him at the Francisco Marroquín University. When I went to present a book called Unmasking the Keynesian Lie, my depth in the Austrian school was not yet what I would have in the future. But there were already clear signs that, at least, I knew where things were going, at least. And in this talk, for today, I had prepared a sort of synthesis of my recent book, which is called Capitalism. Socialism and the Neoclassical Trap. Basically, it talks about economic theory and political action. It is a book where I basically explore the design problems of neoclassical theory and how it leads to socialism. There are 5 blocks and it seemed to me that, in light of the speeches and in light of the interactions I was having, I might be able to contribute something of value by telling you about my experience, especially as it has to do with politics. So, I am going to divide the talk. I am going to talk a little about what has to do with the things we are doing in the government and, on the other hand,
de la discusión que quería dar, pero de
Later
manera
I
mucho
will
más
go into the
sintética
topic of
y
the
mucho más
discussion I
concentrada.
wanted to give, but in a much more synthetic and much more
Una de las
concentrated
cosas
way.
que mencionó
One of the
el
things that Professor
profesor
Huerta de
Soto,
Soto mentioned,
extremadamente
extremely
valiosas,
valuable, is when he
es
points out
cuando
the
él
role of knowledge
señala
of
el
economic
rol del
theory.
conocimiento de la teoría económica. Les puedo asegurar que eso es fundamental.
I can
Hay un
assure
dicho que a
you
mí me
that this is
gusta
fundamental. There is a saying that I like to
levantar
repeat
recurrentemente
repeatedly,
que
which
dice,
says,
el que no sabe
he
lo que
who
busca
does
no
not
entiende lo
know
que
what he is
encuentra.
looking for does not
Y
understand
esto
what he
tiene
finds, and this plays a
un rol
fundamental role
fundamental
when
cuando
one
uno diseña la
designs
política
economic
económica
policy
y
and
cómo
how
uno se
one
aferra a
sticks
ese
to
rumbo.
that
O sea,
course.
nosotros desde el primer momento siempre supimos hacia dónde queremos ir.
From the
Es decir, el
first
norte está
moment we
claro,
knew
nosotros
where we
queremos
wanted
ir
to
ahí.
go, that
Y
is,
eso
the
viene dado
north
por
is
todo lo
clear.
que uno hace su
We want to
background,
go there, and
de la
that is
forma en la cual
given
vemos
by
la economía,
everything
pero
one
digo, no es
does,
solamente
one's
la cuestión de la
background,
economía.
the
Nosotros
way in which
interpretamos la
one
política
sees the
económica desde una
economy.
cuestión moral.
But it is not only the
El diseño de
question
la
of the
política económica tiene que
economy,
ver con una
we
cuestión
interpret the economy
fundamentalmente
from a
moral.
moral question.
Es decir, cuáles son los
The
valores que están
design of
detrás de eso.
economic
Y
policy has to
claramente que
do with a
frente a eso
fundamentally moral
nada puede
question,
contra el
that is,
liberalismo.
what are the values
Por
that
eso
are behind it?
recurrentemente
And clearly, in the
nuestros
face
actos
of
de
that,
campaña
nothing can
cerraban
stand
con
against
la
liberalism.
definición de liberalismo
That
de
is
Alberto Venegas
why,
Lynch, hijo,
recurrently, in our
con algunas
campaign
notaciones que
events
yo
we
le hice,
closed with Alberto
que es esto de
Venegas
el liberalismo es el
Lynch's
respeto
Jr.
irrestricto del proyecto de vida
definition
del
of
prójimo,
liberalism,
basado en
with
el
some
principio de no
changes that
agresión
I
y en
made.
defensa del derecho a la vida, a la libertad y a
Liberalism
la
is the
propiedad,
unrestricted
y
respect for the
cuyas
life
instituciones
project
son
of
la
others,
propiedad
based on
privada,
the
los mercados
principle of
libres de comercio
non-aggression and the
estatal,
defense of the
la
right
libre
to life,
competencia, pero
liberty,
en
and
el sentido
property.
austríaco, no en el sentido
Its
neoclásico, la
institutions are
división del
private
trabajo, la
property,
cooperación
markets
social,
free of state
y donde
intervention,
solamente
free
se puede ser
competition,
exitoso si
but
el
in
mundo
the
al prójimo
Austrian
proviene de la mejor
sense,
calidad
not in the
posible.
neoclassical sense, the
En ese
division of
sentido, eso es
labor,
un marco
social
rector,
cooperation.
y nosotros
And where
como
one can
objetivo
only be
tenemos
successful by
que
serving
hacer
others with
que
goods of
Argentina
better
vuelva a ser grande
quality and better
nuevamente.
price.
Y la única forma de
In
lograr
that
eso
sense, that is a
es
guiding
que Argentina
framework,
vuelva a
and our
ser
objective is
libre
to make Argentina
nuevamente.
great again.
Y eso es lo que marca el
The only
norte.
way to
Y la verdad es
achieve
que
that is
cuando
for
ustedes plantean el
Argentina to be
objetivo,
free
les
again.
aviso, no es
And that is what marks the North. The
un
truth is that when you
movimiento
set the
rectilíneo
objective,
uniforme. Es decir,
I warn
uno
you
no
that
va
it is not a
zigzagueando porque
uniform
es
rectilinear
un
movement.
imbécil
That is,
ineficiente.
you don't go
No es que en el
zigzagging
medio puede
because
ser
you're
que
an
haya
inefficient
pozos, haya un
idiot,
montón de
but
cosas,
in the
uno tiene
middle
que
there
ir
may be holes.
esquivando.
There are a lot of
Y no
things and you have to
solamente
avoid
eso, sino
them.
que también
And you don't
se
know.
encuentra con otros problemas, digamos, donde los oponentes políticos también disparan.
That
Entonces
is to
ustedes
say,
están
one does not
esquivando
zigzag because one
los
is an
pozos,
inefficient idiot,
el
but in the
camino,
middle there may be
y mientras
holes,
que
there
ustedes
are a lot
están
of things and one has to
esquivando,
dodge them.
digo, están
And not only
los
that,
opositores
but one
disparando,
also encounters other
y no solo que
problems,
están los
where political
opositores
opponents
disparando,
also shoot.
sino que además,
So, you are dodging
como si
holes
todo
in the
eso fuera
road, and
poco,
while you are dodging, the
como
opponents are
nosotros decidimos
shooting.
cortar la publicidad oficial,
And not only are
los
the
medios de
opponents
comunicación se
shooting, but
dedican
as if
todo
all
el
that were
tiempo
not
a
enough,
estar
since we
hablando peste
decided to
sobre
cut
nosotros,
official advertising, the
y
media
como
spends
si
all
esto
their
fuera
time
poco,
talking badly about us.
mientras que defendemos la
As
idea de
if
la
this were not
libertad,
enough, while we defend the ideas of
también aparecen
freedom,
los
the
liberales
Egyptian
egipcios,
liberals also appear.
que por un lado hablan de libertad y que por otro lado
Who on the
le
one
venden
hand
la
talk
patente
about
de corso al
freedom
mejor
and on the
postor.
other sell the letter of marque
Hasta
to
lo
the
hacen hablar
highest
de la
bidder.
eficiencia del gasto público.
They even talk about the efficiency of public spending.
Y
And
no
not
solo
only
eso,
that, one has
que
to
uno
keep
tiene que
moving
seguir
forward
avanzando
and
y seguir
fighting for
peleando por las
ideas,
ideas.
and the worst of
Y
all
lo
is
peor de
that
todo es
one
que
even
uno
has to
tiene que
deal with
lidiar con las
lies and so
mentiras y
on.
demás. En ese sentido, les voy a contar mi
In
versión
that
de lo
sense,
que
I
nos
am going to tell
encontramos,
you
de
my
lo que
version
estamos
of where we
haciendo
are,
y a dónde estamos yendo,
what we are doing and where
para
we are
después sí
going,
empezar a
to begin
discutir
to discuss some of the
algo,
theoretical
digamos, del
background
trasfondo
that,
teórico
from my point of
desde mi punto
view,
de
is
vista es
important.
importante.
When we came to power, Argentina's twin deficits amounted to 17 points of GDP. Basically, you know, those who have studied all the literature on early crisis indicators.
Toda la literatura de indicadores tempranos de crisis que un déficit.
That twin deficits of 4 points of GDP is a yellow light. 8 points of GDP is a warning of cataclysm. Imagine receiving 17 points of GDP of twin deficits. That is what we received. Structurally, of those 17 points, 15 were in the national public sector, where 5 points corresponded to the treasury deficit and 10 points of GDP to the central bank, that is, the quasi-fiscal deficit.
PBI en el Banco Central, es decir, el déficit cuasi fiscal.
To give you an idea of the monetary excesses that the previous government made, over the course of 4 years they had issued 28 points of GDP to finance the treasury. Of those 28, 13 were issued during the last year of government, in the electoral adventure in which they launched themselves trying to win by any means. In fact, among other things, being the largest dirty campaign in the history of humanity, where, for example, a certain government gave the official government $1,000 million to spend on dirtying whoever was going to run in that election. That is why, at some point, you went on YouTube anywhere in the world, you wanted to check or see a video of mine, and something appeared saying that I was saying some atrocity. If these things were raised by people who even knew they were lies. What's more, in one of those lies that someone linked to liberalism told, he almost killed our candidate for Minister of Education, who had heart problems and almost ended up being sued for something that was supposedly leaked by one of our people. In that sense, what I want to point out is that we did it with a chainsaw in the campaign, which had to do with cutting public spending with $1. Which was the popular way that people understood currency competition and eliminating the central bank. But they told us it was impossible. In fact, today the sommeliers of the adjustment and who talk about the adjustment and what's more, scissors and blender. I didn't know that if 90% of the adjustment is a chainsaw adjustment, they call it a scissors. It's a problem of order of magnitude, that is, 10% of the adjustment is a blender. But well, that's how intellectually honest some economists are. The sad thing is that the liberals also repeat these things, which is even more serious, but some are sold out and get paid to repeat these kinds of aberrations. In this sense, one of the most formidable things that happened to us is that when we had the first cabinet meeting, when I started to say what we wanted to do, some parties said that what I wanted to do was impossible. Therefore, I said that those who believed it was impossible should leave because I would go. It was a 40-degree day, that is. If I went I would ask the ice cream man on the corner selling ice cream, he also said it was impossible. So I didn't care if they told me it was impossible. They had to show me how to do what I wanted to do. And so we started and made the fiscal adjustment. In fact, we made the largest fiscal adjustment in the history of humanity, not just in Argentina. At the beginning, basically with the disaster we were facing, we had seen that we had to stop the monetary emission. In the first week of December, prices were rising at 1% per day, or 3,700% per year. In the first 15 days of December, they had accelerated to a rate of 7,500% per year. Not only that, but when you take the wholesale inflation, which is an early indicator of inflation, in fact the inflation in December was 54%. That annualized gives 17,000%. I understand that the 35% inflation of the last month is a frighteningly high number and that, annualized, it is 50% annually. But the truth is that going from 17,000 to 50% annually without having hyperinflation in the middle that liquefies real wages, without having price controls, without fixing the exchange rate and without having expropriations, well, that is an incredible adventure.
Pero es más, la dificultad monetaria no solo era todo lo que
But what is
había emitido el
more,
gobierno
the
anterior.
monetary difficulty was not only due to everything that the previous government had issued, it was not only the problem of financing the treasury, but it was also the problem of remunerated liabilities that generated a 10-point fiscal deficit.
También tuvimos que tomar estrategias bastante
In that sense, we also had to take quite difficult strategies where the serial blunderers who continue to criticize today made mistakes, but none of them recognize that they made mistakes. Because instead of trying to get to a positive real interest rate, what we are trying to do is to arbitrate with foreign currency, with the dollar against which the Argentines substitute. So, that implied a high rate in dollars but in negative real terms. And if the sterilization worked, it would also allow us to strongly lower remunerated liabilities and at the same time the interest rate, which was above 250%. Today it is at 40% and the quasi-fiscal deficit of 10 points of GDP will end up being 1 point, because of what has already happened, not because of what is coming. And this is also important, because the previous government, where that debt with the central bank was 30, 60, 90, 120, 180, 270 and 360 days, I don't know if naively, but they moved it all to one day. They did not do this by chance, they did not do it innocently. Argentina had a 200% exchange rate gap. The exchange rate between the parallel and the official was 3 to 1. In addition, it had debt with importers for the equivalent of $50 billion, so part of the productive system was stopped, because no one could import anymore. In addition, Argentina had the credit. The agreement with the Fallen Fund, we had $25 billion of debt that were maturing externally, where the great majority was with multilateral organizations, and we were with that problem.
Teníamos cerca de $15,000 millones de dólares de dividendos retenidos.
We had close to $15 billion of retained dividends. We had debt maturities in pesos for the equivalent of $90 billion. So, basically, the remunerated liabilities will be practically 4 times the monetary base. Therefore, what was the great bet of the previous government? It was that we would not be libertarian liberals, but that we would be libertarianized liberals. In that situation, they believed that we were going to ignore the relationships between stock and flows and that a stock with those characteristics could be converted into a flow instantly. And in that way, in one day, the amount of money would multiply between 4 and 5 times, and we would have the entire strangulation of the currencies that wanted to leave. In that context, we would have generated hyperinflation, and then the Peronist machinery of looting and so on would have done all the work during the month of December. What was left of December for them to return in the month of January? Faced with that situation, being very critical of the liberals, especially the Egyptian liberals,
siendo muy crítico por los liberales, en especial los liberales egipcios.
In that sense, what we decided, and here there was an intensive use of economic theory. We were in the Libertador Hotel and the colors of the hotel are violet, that is, more spontaneous order is impossible. So, we were with Luis Toto Caputo, this brilliant man who I have as Minister of Economy, who is now the President of the Central Bank. Santiago Basili was also in that meeting, Feed Furies. Martín Vauthier, and we had to decide where to put the exchange rate. We knew that if we opened, we would generate a disaster.
Sabíamos que si abríamos generábamos un desastre. Sabíamos que íbamos a ser castigados.
We knew that we were going to be punished by the libertarian liberals or those who ignore the problem of stocks. They would be fine with the other nickname. And one of the things, the market consensus so fatally arrogant, said that we had to put the exchange rate at 600 and that based on that, given that 600, there was a hypothesis of better dynamics of the inflation rate.
Y que en función de eso, dado ese 600,
by the way, we put the exchange rate at 800 because corrected by the country tax it would equal the market exchange rate. So, they said that it was going to be a much worse inflationary disaster. And it turns out that now, with a higher exchange rate, there is less inflation. And they are the same ones who talk about the delayed exchange rate. They have a serious problem of inconsistency of models. I say, because then they say, no, because this is my opinion, said all the serial blunderers. They didn't get it right. I warn you, there are very few who got it right. I just had the chance to know. I just had the chance to greet a person who introduced herself and told me that she was a friend of Pablo Arriazu's son, who is one of the few who does see it. And in that sense, why did we choose the exchange rate there? And this is pure economic theory. Because if I went with a number closer to the market exchange rate, even though it was not perfectly market, which was the interesting thing, I would reduce the excess demand for foreign currency. And by reducing the excess demand for foreign currency, I would reduce the excess supply of the rest of the economy. So, by reducing the excess of bonds, the price of bonds would rise and, therefore, the interest rate and country risk would fall. Therefore, the level of economic activity would also shrink, the difference between savings and investment and, therefore, the excess supply of goods would shrink and, therefore, activity would fall less. Not only that, but the excess supply in the labor market was also getting smaller and, therefore, real wages were lower. And this is interesting because anyone who had said that we were going to make a fiscal adjustment of 15 points of GDP would have told us that we were going to blow up. In fact, we had a monetary imbalance worse than that of the Rodrigazo crisis of 1975. The balance sheet situation of the central bank was worse than that of the central bank in 1989. prior to Alfonsin's hyperinflation, and the social indicators were worse than at the end of convertibility in 2001. Therefore, not only did we have all the conditions for it to be the most important crisis in Argentine history, because it combined the three elements of the three worst crises in Argentina, but we also had structural weaknesses in terms of legislative structure and power structure. And that is also very interesting, and now I am going to reflect on that. In that context, note that making an adjustment of these characteristics, the GDP in the first quarter fell 7%. Of course, one says, it is not tremendous. Now, when you take the convertibility crisis in 2002, the GDP fell 10.9%, almost 11%, but in the second quarter, where all the adjustments were made, the GDP fell 16%. That is to say, the use of economic theory not only prevented, but at least 10 more points of GDP fall. That, in social terms, is not minor because we also made a whole revolution in what has to do with the social issue. We knew that the adjustment was going to be very hard. We knew that it was going to be recessive because when one makes an adjustment, savings increase and that has a counterpart of investment. Activity is going to fall and that was going to be felt in terms of employment and in terms of real wages. And we already had a very high level of poor and indigent people. Therefore, there was a doubling of the universal allocation per child of the food plan so that children do not lack food, or a plan called 1,000 Days, which is to give assistance to pregnant women. In addition, support was given to students so that they can have school supplies. And not only that, but also, to avoid the trauma of having to change schools for a child and the situation that this also generates in the family, we gave assistance so that they could cover the fees of low-income private schools. Despite all this support, obviously the fiscal adjustment in the first months reached 7 points of GDP. Since we needed 5, we already let 1 point go. So, with the 6 from the Treasury, plus the 9 from the central bank, we are at 15. What's more? Now with all this the country would have exploded and, however, it did not explode. And yet, they criticize the government's social policy. Well, because there is something that the government did that was interesting, and that is to put an end to the intermediaries of poverty, that is, people who support the noble cause of providing support to those most in need. Although we know that deep down, as Professor Huerta de Soto says, plans against poverty generate more poverty. But even with that in mind, we changed the dynamics of assistance. Historically, in Argentina, assistance was giving people fish. In our case, the revolutionaries, that was the name of the ministry. It is called the Ministry of Human Capital. Our objective is not to give people fish. Our objective is to teach them to fish, to teach them to be an entrepreneur. And if they can, to have their own fishing company.
Y en ese contexto también hubo algo muy interesante.
And in that context there was also something very interesting. I warn you because if you look in the newspapers or get information from the media or from biased analysts, they have criticized the Minister of Human Capital enormously. They believe that, in addition, the Minister of Human Capital has a defect. She is a friend of mine, so she has to be honest.
yo tendría problemas en echar a alguien.
So you think I would have problems kicking someone out of my cabinet because he is a friend? Well, the chief of staff who was ejected 18 years ago, who was a friend of mine, did not meet the objectives and left. Hint. Here it is about meeting the objectives. The one who meets them, and the one who does not meet them, even if I have known him for 20 years. 30 years outside, and there too, if you look closely, we are taking inflation. When you start to look at the activity indicators, if you look at those of the first quarter, they are clearly bad. But when you start to look at the indicators of April and some indicators that are already appearing from May, you will clearly see a rebound, that the economy is rebounding, that the economy is recovering. I see them so interested that it seems to me that I am not going to talk about economic theory and I am only going to talk about what we are doing, that is, applied liberalism one-on-one, said by the one who is doing it.
Se acabó la tentación, así que ahora voy a hablar de lo que estoy haciendo.
The temptation is over, and now I am going to talk about what I am doing. In that sense, there was also something very interesting. One of the things that the Minister of Human Capital discovered was that when social plans were given, they were given a card. When they were given that card, one believed that the beneficiary received the full amount. Well, I can tell you that this was not the case. How did it work? When you received that program, you later had to certify that you had worked, and when you went to get that certification, half of it was left there. So, knowing that the first quarter was going to be very hard, one of the things we did, a great action by the Minister of Human Capital, was precisely to remove the obligation to receive the benefit. Well, that situation was quite complicated. Not for the people, who were now going to receive double the amount of money, and that is why, instantly when we did this, the poverty managers announced a massive march. In that massive march, we had the information. They were planning to gather 100,000 people. They said that 50,000 were going to go and then show that 100,000 were going as a great achievement. So, you can imagine. When the Minister of Human Capital did this, the number of things they came out to say at the end. This is a liberal government that ends up being populism, right-wing populism. And in reality, it was cutting off the thieves of the poverty managers. In that context, they went out to do a march, and they're also with our brilliant Minister of Security, Dr. Bullrich. Who also had the greatness, although her option for change was defeated in the elections, not only supported us in the electoral process but also agreed to be our Minister of Security. Together with the Minister of Infrastructure at that time, what did we do? We created a number so that people could report the extortions. We said that he who cuts does not get paid. And that, the Minister of Infrastructure, what he did, he used the transportation network, the one he used the most, to say aberrant things about me. To tell them that if they were not going to go to the marches, nothing would happen, that they were going to continue collecting their plans. And at the same time, Drive. Bullrich presented me with a security protocol that I did not hesitate for half a second to support unconditionally. On the day of the march, we ended up putting 12,000 troops in the national government to recover one of the demands of the population. which was to recover the street that was taken over by vandals and that the entire population was being extorted by this group of criminals.
¿Para qué? Para recuperar
Well,
una de las
of the
demandas de
100,000
la
people
población que
they
era
expected to
recuperar la
take,
calle, que estaba siendo tomada por los vándalos y que toda la población era extorsionada por este conjunto de delincuentes. Bueno, de las 100.000 personas que esperaban
they
llevaron
took
3.000. Había más
3,000.
efectivos
There were more troops
que,
than people in the march,
que
and that
personas en la
meant a
marcha.
strong blow to those
Eso
organizations.
implicó un fuerte
Not only
golpe
did we
también
begin to
sobre
put
esas
inflation in
organizaciones,
order, but
y
we are
además no
recovering
solo
the
que empezamos a
economy,
poner en
we
caja la
also put the
inflación,
street in
estamos
order.
recuperando la
Today in
economía, sino
Argentina,
que
it is
además
not about
también
the violent, but about
pusimos
those
en
who
caja
want to
la calle.
work.
Es decir, hoy en Argentina la calle no es de los violentos, la calle es de la gente que quiere trabajar, y el que corta no cobra, y el
And
que
those
hace
who cut
disturbio
do
va
not get
preso.
paid. And those who cause disturbances go to jail. But it is not only a question of what we are proposing in terms of the stabilization strategy and what has to do with the strategy of
No
putting
solo,
control in the
digamos,
streets.
es una cuestión de lo que nosotros estamos planteando en términos de lo que sería de la estrategia de
We also
estabilización,
said that we were
lo que
going
tiene
to
que ver
aim
con
to
la
recover
estrategia de
economic
poner el
growth
control
and
en la
that,
calle.
obviously, that implied a
Nosotros también
reform
dijimos
of the
que íbamos a
state.
apuntar a recuperar
Well,
el
the
crecimiento
first thing we
económico.
did was to reduce the number of
Y que
ministries by
obviamente, digamos,
half,
eso implicaba hacer una
which,
reforma del
much to my
Estado.
regret because I would have
Bueno, lo
liked
primero que
another to
hicimos
be
fue
my
bajar
most
la cantidad de
popular
ministerios a
video,
la
is
mitad.
outside.
Que
That
es
is
muy
the
a mi
most
pesar, porque
popular
me hubiera
video
gustado
of
que
those
otro
I
fuera mi
have and
video
that
más popular
everyone
en el
turned
mundo,
to.
es afuera.
Just like the
Y
one
ese
that
es el
there
video
is
más
no
popular
money.
de los que tengo,
And this
que
is
todo el
very
mundo, pero
interesting
se
with the
volvió,
one that there
al
is no
igual que
money.
no hay plata. Digamos, esto es muy interesante lo que pasa con el no
The
hay plata.
different politicians of different stripes are either
Los
totally lost
distintos
because they are
políticos
the
de
most
distintos
rancid
pelajes
socialists or they are pure
o están
socialists,
perdidos totalmente
Keynesians.
porque, digamos, son
Two
socialistas de
types
lo
that
más
ignore the
rancio,
budget
o son socialistas
restrictions.
cool, o sea,
Look,
keynesianos.
I am going to
Pero
tell you
todos tipos que
something.
ignoran la restricción de presupuesto. Miren, les voy a contar algo. Había algo que como
There was
cuando era
something
diputado
that,
me
when I was a
producía
deputy, produced a tremendous thing in me. It put me in a
cosa
tremendous
tremenda, me
bad
ponía de
mood.
tremendo mal humor.
And it is
Y
that
es
they
que
assigned us time to
nos
speak,
asignaban
each one
tiempo
based
para
on
hablar.
the
O sea,
size of the
cada cual,
block that he
en
had.
función del tamaño del
He
bloque
had a
que tenía,
certain
iba
amount of
teniendo, digamos,
time.
una determinada
So,
cantidad de
if you
tiempo.
wanted to understand why in 123 years, 113 had had a fiscal
Si ustedes
deficit,
querían entender por qué de 123 años, 113 habíamos tenido
if of
déficit
the
fiscal,
22
si de las
crises that we
22
had
crisis que
from
tuvimos desde el año
1901 until
1950 hasta
now,
ahora,
of the
20, de
22,
las 22,
20
20
had a
tenían origen
fiscal
fiscal,
origin. There you have
ahí
it.
lo tenían todo.
All in the
En la
chamber
Cámara
where
donde
the
se
budget
vota
is
el
voted.
presupuesto,
No one
ninguno
respected the
respetaba la
budget
restricción de
restriction.
presupuesto. Si le
If
daban
they were
5
given
minutos
5
hablaban 10, si le
minutes, they
daban 10
spoke for
hablaban 20.
10.
Son unos
And if they were
violadores
given 10,
sistemáticos
they
del
spoke for
presupuesto.
20.
¿Cómo no iban a
They
hacer
are
el desastre que
systematic
hicieron?
violators of the budget.
Entonces,
How could they not be
ahí
the
también
disaster that they made?
dimos
So, there we also fought some
algunas
important
batallas
battles
importantes
that
que
were key
fueron
to what we are doing,
claves
because one of
para
the
lo que
things that you
estamos
can
haciendo, ¿no?
notice in all
Porque
my speeches
una
is
de las
that I
cosas
always said,
que ustedes pueden
I
tomar
am
todos
not
mis
going to
discursos
vote
es
for budgets with a
siempre dije
fiscal
yo no
deficit.
voy a votar
And
presupuestos
he
con déficit
explained
fiscal.
that, for example, if you have a fiscal
Y
deficit,
explicaba
and that is why the issue of values
que,
is
por
so
ejemplo,
important.
si ustedes tienen déficit fiscal, y esto por eso es tan importante el tema de los valores, si ustedes
If
lo
you
votan
vote
con
for it with debt,
endeudamiento,
that is
eso es
profoundly
profundamente
immoral.
inmoral.
Because, in
Porque en
reality,
realidad lo
what
que
you
están
are
diciendo
saying
es
is
que la
that today's
fiesta de
party
hoy
is paid for with
se
future
paga con impuestos
taxes.
futuros.
That is,
Es decir, que
that
ustedes
you are
están de
partying
fiesta hoy,
today
le
and
están
you are
pasando la
passing the
cuenta
bill on to
a
your
sus hijos, a
children,
sus
to your
nietos,
grandchildren.
y en lugares donde está vigente la agenda
And
asesina del
in
aborto,
places where the
hasta gente
murderous
que ni siquiera
abortion
nació
agenda is
podría
in
llegar a ser el
force.
extremo.
Even people who have not even been born could become the extreme.
Entonces el endeudamiento es inmoral. Ese es el primer punto. El segundo punto es
So, in debt it is immoral. That is the first point. The second is, in fact, Argentina abused that so much that it is the biggest defaulter in modern history. By the way, we received the country with 2,900 points of country risk. We managed to lower it to around 1150. Until a few weeks ago, when the policy that not only does not help, but also tries to destroy, made us jump the country risk to 1,600. Now, it is going down again because under no circumstances am I going to give up the fiscal balance. They are going to have to kill me. They are going to have to get me out of the Casa Rosada to make a fiscal deficit because I am not going to give it to them. The other thing they can do is finance it with monetary emission. Not for nothing did Argentina take 13 zeros out of the currency. It had 2 hyperinflations without war. We could take 3 more zeros out of it. It is also immoral. As the brilliant book by Professor Ricardo Rojas says, inflation is a crime, the real crime. And Professor Rojas puts it very well, it is the monetary emission, the seigniorage. Because those economists, not you, can issue up to what the demand for money grows and if it were linear with the GDP. So, as soon as the GDP grows, that is also a farce, that is a crime. It is also a scam, because the fact that inflation is zero does not mean that there is no scam. Because if they had not issued, there would have been deflation. And that would have returned the money to the people, and that is a very pro-poor policy. However, the pseudo-progressives like to issue money like crazy. So, at that point, in the cleanup that we did at the central bank today, I practically tell you that the quasi-fiscal is zero. From here on, zero. There were about 18,000 left. We had a monetary base of 15 billion pesos and we had remunerated liabilities of 18 billion. Of those, 12 were in public banks, 7 in the Banco Nación, where a large part of those holdings on the other side are from the National Treasury. As for the province of Buenos Aires, which is 3 billion, the Soviet of the province of Buenos Aires has such a large fiscal deficit that it uses the provincial bank and therefore, it cannot touch it, and the rest is mostly with the city government, with whom we have an excellent relationship. So, we only have a problem of 6 billion. The last placement of bills to make the mutation from the central bank to the treasury amounted to almost 6 billion pesos. They are almost on the ropes, we have them knocked out. The only problem we have left in the central bank at this moment is a contingent instrument, some puts. The previous government, as it could not obtain financing for the Treasury, from the Treasury and with the endorsement of the International Monetary Fund, used contingent instruments. And what is the problem with that? That in the balance with the central bank, that liability is recorded for the value of the contingent, that is, with a very small fraction of the liability that you have open. So, you practically don't see it inside the central bank and nevertheless, there is a potential for issuance of 4 points of GDP. Therefore, the day we finish with that, the second stage of the monetary reform will begin. Once avoided, God has time. In that context, I need to close the agreement with the puts and in that I have to come to an agreement with the banks.
Nosotros además estamos trabajando en una reforma del sistema financiero, en separar la banca de inversión.
We are also working on a reform of the financial system to separate investment banking from the reserve of value, so that the system becomes a reserve of value.
de valor
In other
cerca del
words,
100%.
the reserve of value is a 100% reserve, and in investment banking you will have securities and it will be adjusted based on how prices fluctuate. Therefore, the runs are over. So, with the fiscal tap closed, the financial tap closed, the external tap closed, because the exchange rate is going to be free, we are going to go not only to a system of free competition of currencies,
libre, vamos a ir no solo a un sistema de libre competencia de monedas,
but we are going to declare the issuance of money a crime against humanity.
un delito de lesa humanidad. Y en ese caso, si llegara a haber emisión
And in
monetaria,
that case,
va a ir
if there were
preso
to
el
be
presidente de
issuance
la
of
nación.
money, the president of the nation will go to jail. I think they can approve it because they are so eager to put me in jail. The Minister of Economy, the President of the Central Bank, the Board of the Central Bank and the deputies and senators who support a measure of that nature will go to jail.
Una medida de esas características.
That said, what is going to happen? You can tell me, no, well, but Argentina systematically violated the laws. That's true, but since it is classified as a crime against humanity, it is imprescriptible. So a government can come and change it, but another liberal can come after and put all the criminals in jail.
Por lo tanto, al quedar fija la cantidad de dinero de pesos,
Therefore, since the amount of pesos is fixed, and to the extent that individuals need to monetize, they will bring their own currencies and will make transactions in the currencies they want. And if you look closely, that will make the peso have much less role or importance within the amount of transactions that are made, and there will come a time when it will be so small that we will close the central bank.
vamos a cerrar el Banco Central. Finalmente, voy a hablar sobre el programa de crecimiento económico.
Finally, I will talk about the economic growth program, I will talk about the transition, and I will talk about the reforms. A note of color, because there are many libertarados, Egyptian libertarians, who say that we are increasing the fiscal pressure.
Que dicen que nosotros estamos aumentando la presión fiscal. Entonces dice, Milei no es liberal en eso.
Milei is not a liberal in that because he raised taxes.
Bueno, vamos contra
Well,
esos
let's
mentirosos.
go against those
Si
liars.
yo tenía
If I
15
had 15
puntos de
points of
emisión
monetary
monetaria,
emission, 15 points of
15 puntos de
seigniorage,
señorías
which
que
is
has robado
direct
directo
theft
sobre
from
los
Argentines,
y solo me llevé 1,5 puntos de impuesto país y le devolví a los argentinos
and I only
13
took a
puntos y
point and
medio.
a half of the country's tax and returned 13.5 points to Argentines. Did the tax pressure increase or did it decrease in net terms? Learn to do the math. You idiots. What's more, I'll underline it for you. Public spending in real terms fell by
El gasto
30%.
público en términos reales cayó 30%. La verdadera presión fiscal
The
que
real
enfrenta
tax pressure
un
that a
país,
country
¿sabe qué es?
faces, do you
El
know what
gasto
it
público.
is?
Y cayó
It's public
30%.
spending. And it fell by 30%. Therefore, we are chasing the state out of the way. And why is that
Por lo
important?
tanto, o sea,
Because
estamos
now there are
corriendo al
15
Estado
points
del
of
medio. ¿Por qué es
GDP
importante
that
esto?
were eaten up by the
Porque ahora
state
hay
and
15
now,
puntos
what does
del
it
PBI
become?
que se los comía el Estado y ahora se convierte en ¿qué? En el ahorro que vuelve
Savings
a la
that return
inversión.
to
Por lo
investment.
tanto, la inversión va a
Therefore,
ser
now
financiada por
investment
ese
is
ahorro.
going to be
Pensar
financed
que
by
cuando
those
nosotros llegamos
savings.
al poder, se
Think
hablaba
that
de la
when we came to
hiperinflación.
power, there was talk of
El 85%
hyperinflation.
de los argentinos creían
85% of
que iba a haber una
Argentines believed that there
hiperinflación.
would be
Hoy menos
hyperinflation.
del 20%
Today,
cree que
less
hay
than
una que puede
20%
haber una
believe that there could
hiperinflación.
be
De ser el problema
hyperinflation.
más acuciante
From
de la
being
Argentina, la
Argentina's
inflación,
most
hoy pasó a
pressing
estar en tercer
problem,
lugar.
inflation
No me
has
vengan a
now
decir
moved
que no
into
se
third
puede, porque sí
place.
se puede.
Tell me that it can't happen, because it can. And not only that, but credit has also returned to 30-year
Y no solo eso,
terms.
sino que además volvió el crédito a 30 años. Vaya que lo estamos haciendo.
We're doing it.
Entonces,
So,
no solo
not
eso,
only will that be
que va
an
a ser un
element that
elemento
will
que va a
boost savings
potenciar
and, therefore,
el ahorro y
investment.
por ende la inversión,
Argentina
que
is an
tenemos una economía
economy
que
that
viene
comes
de
from
20
20
años de
years of
populismo
wild
salvaje,
populism
que
and
está
is deeply
profundamente
undercapitalized.
descapitalizada. Por lo tanto,
Therefore,
eso hace
that
que el
makes the
valor del
value of
producto
the
marginal del
marginal
capital,
product of capital,
si ustedes
if you want the
quieren
return
el
on the cash
retorno
flow
del
of the
flujo de fondos de
firm,
las
if
firmas,
you
si
want to
quieren,
put
por
it in
términos de
terms of
finanzas,
finance.
eso hace que sean enormes y que estén muy por encima del WACC, o sea, del coste de oportunidad. Y eso también potencia la inversión. Pero como si todo esto
That
fuera
makes
poco,
them enormous and well above
en
the
la medida que la economía
WACC, that
argentina
is, the
recupere,
opportunity cost.
¿sí? Y se vuelva a
And that
expandir,
also boosts investment. But as
nosotros
if
no
all
vamos
that
a
were
aumentar
not
el gasto
enough,
público, lo vamos a
as
mantener fijo.
Argentina
Por lo
recovers its
tanto, en la
economy and
medida
expands again, we are not
que
going to increase
uno
public
pueda
spending, we are going to keep it
ir
fixed.
creciendo y se generen nuevos
Therefore,
recursos,
as long as one
nosotros
can
vamos a
continue to
ir
grow and
bajando
new
impuestos.
resources are
Y de hecho,
generated,
el
we are
impuesto
going to
país que
lower
hoy está en
taxes.
17,5%,
And in fact, the country tax that
determinar
is
de
currently at
perfeccionarse la salida de la
17.5%,
ley bases y la ley fiscal, que está enviada por necesidad de los gobernadores, no por nosotros, porque tenemos equilibrio.
in accordance with the
En ese
perfection of the
contexto,
exit of the
vamos a
basic
bajar
law
ese
and the
impuesto de
fiscal law that is
17,5
sent out of
a
necessity of the
7,5. Así
governors,
que,
not by
para
us,
aquellos que
because
hablan
we
de la
have
suba de impuestos, no
equilibrium.
solo mienten que no toman el
In that
agregado,
context, we
burros
are
que no
going to
entienden de
lower
equilibrio
that tax
general,
from
sino que
17.5
además
to
también empezamos con una
7.5.
reducción de impuestos.
So, for those who talk about raising taxes, not only are they lying and not taking into account
Por
the
otra parte,
aggregate,
hay gente que dice que no
they
tenemos un
don't
programa de
understand
largo plazo.
general equilibrium, but we are also
Es
starting with the
increíble porque
reduction of
la reforma
taxes.
más grande que se hizo en la
On the
Argentina fue
other
la que hizo
hand, there are
Menem.
people who say that we
Esa
do not
reforma
have a
del
long-term
Estado tenía
program. It's
100 artículos,
incredible,
eran 100
because the
reformas.
biggest reform that was made in
Que dice,
Argentina
no,
was the
la
one
ley
that Menem
desguazada,
made,
ley
and that
base.
reform of the
Bueno, la
state had
desguazada ley
100
base es
articles,
5
there
veces
were
más grande
100
que la
reforms.
reforma de Menem. Y no solo eso, si le sumamos el decreto de necesidad y urgencia, que la evidencia ha probado que tengo razón,
And they say, no, the gutted
la
basic law.
reforma es 8
Well,
veces más
the
grande.
gutted basic law
Si
is
estamos
5
haciendo
times
la
bigger than
reforma
Menem's
estructural más
reform.
grande de la historia argentina,
Not only
es 8
that,
veces
if
más
we
grande
add
a
the
la que le
decree of
sigue.
necessity and
¿Por qué es
urgency,
importante esto?
which evidence has proven I'm right, the reform
Porque
is
aquellos
8
países
times
que son
bigger.
más libres son 12
In
veces más
other
ricos que
words,
los
we are
pobres, que los
making the
países
biggest
oprimidos.
structural reform in Argentine history,
Crecen más
which
que el
is 8
doble.
times bigger than the one
Tienen
that
25
follows.
veces menos de
Why
pobres
is
en el
this
formato
important?
estándar, 50
Because
veces
those
menos
countries
en el
that are
formato
freer are
extremo.
12 times freer than those that are
Entonces, ¿por qué es
repressed.
tan importante?
They
Esto
grow
es muy
more than twice
importante
as much, they have 25%
porque
less
estas
poverty
reformas
in
lo
the
que va a hacer que
standard
Argentina
format
en el
and
índice de libertad
50% less
económica
poverty in
escale
the
en
extreme
90
format.
puntos.
And why is
Es
this
decir, que
so
Argentina
important?
entraría en un
This is
sendero
very important,
de
because
crecimiento
these
que podría
reforms will
hacer que
make
en un
Argentina
determinado
climb
periodo
90
de tiempo,
positions in the
llamemos
index of economic freedom.
35, ponga
That
40
is to
años,
say,
nos
Argentina would
podríamos
enter a
convertir
path
en un
of
país
growth
como
that could mean that
Alemania.
in a certain period of
Sin
time,
embargo, tengo algunas
let's
noticias
call it
extras para
35 or
decirte.
40 years, we could become
No,
a
a mí
country
no,
like
para decirme
Germany.
la libertad económica de
However,
Alemania
I have some
no
extra
me
news
gusta.
to tell you. In my opinion, I don't like to resemble Germany's economic freedom.
Es más, el país que más libertad económica tenía
What's
era
more,
Irlanda,
the country that
y
had the
eso
most
en
economic
35
freedom was
años hizo de
Ireland.
ser el país más
And in
miserable de Europa,
35
tener un
years
PIB
it
per
went
cápita
from being the most
50%
miserable
más alto que el de
country in
Estados
Europe
Unidos.
to having a GDP per
Pero
capita
la
50%
verdad, ¿sabe qué?
higher than
Nosotros
that
tenemos
of the
pendientes
United
todavía
States.
3.200 reformas
The truth is
estructurales
that we
más,
have
y no solo que vamos a ser
3,200
libres
more
como Irlanda,
structural
vamos a ser el país
reforms
más libre del
pending,
mundo y
and
no
we
vamos
are
a ser el
not
país más
only going
próspero
to
del
be
mundo.
free like Ireland.
Y para finalizar,
We are
esto sí
going to
ya es
make
lo
the freest
último,
country in the
que
world,
tiene que
and we
ver
are
con
going to make the most
algunas de las
prosperous
cosas que
country
estamos
in the
haciendo.
world. And finally,
A
and
mí
this is the
hay
last thing, and it has to
algunos
do
textos
with some of
que
the
me
things we are
marcaron
doing.
mucho,
There are some texts that have left a deep
y
impression on
la
me.
idea
The combined idea that
combinada,
Kerzner
¿no?,
makes when he
que hace
demonstrates the
Kirchner
moral
cuando
superiority of
demuestra la
capitalism,
superioridad,
because it is interesting how
digamos, en
that book
términos morales del
starts.
capitalismo.
Kerzner says, yes, yes. The productive superiority of capitalism over socialism is undeniable. If it is built on unjust foundations, it is not worth defending. It does not matter that it is more productive. It is built on something unjust and it is not worth defending. So, he advances that it is the only fair system. And for that he uses Locke's principle of appropriation and he uses Hayek's idea of a discovery process in the market. That is very interesting because when you study the literature on economic growth, my specialization with or without money, I am supposed to understand how to grow an economy and how to lower inflation. And it seems that the latter is working and the other, believe me, is also working. But Hayek's approach is very interesting. If you put it and compare it with the theory of economic growth, one of the things he does is look for and try to describe how it reaches a stationary state with or without growth. But the interesting thing is that depending on how you model the production function, a phenomenon called convergence appears.
Que según como ustedes modelen la función de producción, aparece un fenómeno que se llama convergencia.
This is interesting because countries that tend to be lagging behind grow faster than those that are ahead. Market reforms are made and then, in a while, they catch up with developed countries, if you want to call them something. And this is very interesting because if you look at the history of humanity, the number of years it takes to double GDP is less. The first to achieve this was England, which took 58 years, then the United States, and so on until the case of Korea, which took 10 years, or the case of China, which took 7 years. What's more, the case of China is so interesting that it not only doubled GDP per capita in 7 years, but in the 7 years that followed, also, obviously by making pro-market reforms, that is, in 14 years it quadrupled GDP per capita. So, what you see is a process of acceleration. And why does this happen? Because in reality those market opportunities in developed countries have already been discovered. So, what you have to do is have good institutions that defend life, liberty and property, and the principle of non-aggression, the ideas of freedom. And when you do that, you will create an environment for companies to develop, for entrepreneurs to discover and appropriate from their discovery, and that makes it possible for you to converge, and the freer you are, the faster you will do it. And the more technology helps you, the more you will be able to do it. That is why my last tour of the United States had to do with going to see the most important entrepreneurs in the technological world. Because, what is artificial intelligence? It is nothing more or less than a new kind of industrial revolution, a situation where there is an increase in productivity never seen before. And the only risk that this has, you all will have read Hazlitt when he says the hatred of the machine. Well, you will have seen the politicians, it seems that they have the hatred of the machine, the scholarly fallacy. And it is interesting because they are based on a lot of myths, which are all lies that the Austrian school knows are all lies. And with that, what they do is regulate. But what happens? When you regulate, this in economics is the problem of non-convexities. These are those problems that we economists invent in our heads, for certain normative properties. called Pareto optimality in our general equilibrium model, and that in reality have nothing to do with real life. That is why Murray Newton Rothbard's article on monopoly and competition was very revealing for me, where I realized that after teaching 25 years of microeconomics, everything I had taught about market structure was wrong. That is, it was more productive to read those 140 pages in 3 hours than everything I had studied before. But not for nothing. One of my four-legged children is called Murray. And in that sense, monopolies, when I had already taken Adam Smith from Lord Coke's definition of monopoly, were when the monarch or the feudal lord demanded that in a certain place a single product from a single company be sold, and if that was not fulfilled, it was sanctioned by law. Their heads were cut off or they were killed. Now if I have 10 cell phone companies and one appears with its best cell phone or best price and cheaper, and yes, the other 9 are going to go bankrupt. Or are they crying for the candle makers? Damn Edison. Thanks Edison. So, look at this, following the neoclassical paradigm. They try to regulate these companies as if they were competitive in the neoclassical sense. That means that they take away their quasi-rent, that is, their extraordinary benefits. If you take away their quasi-rents, the result is that they become a company with constant returns to scale. That is, they kill their potential for economic growth. That is, with regulations, with which Europe is one of the places in the world that suffers the most from these regulations. Therefore, the place that grows the least in the world, precisely. The state and its regulations are killing economic growth. So, what do we offer them? Deregulation, openness, freedom so that they can invest. Therefore, embracing the ideas of freedom, not punishing the population with the aberration of abortion, because the population allows greater division of labor and, therefore, allows greater economic growth and greater increasing economic returns to scale. Adam Smith's famous pin factory, limited by the size of the market, is a song to defend life, not death. Now I'm going to tell you a funny anecdote about Elon Musk. You're going to like this. We were in the first meeting with Elon Musk and he raises the demographic problem. So we start discussing the demographic issue and he is concerned that the population is growing less and less and that there is a problem with the birth rate. So, the engine of innovation is being slowed down, and he proposes to reverse the brainwashing that was done in the population with everything that was the Club of Rome, whose files were declassified by Nixon, where they proposed a scientific issue on the highs of abortion, but what they don't know is that it is an old agenda. If you look at the book of Exodus in the Torah, or Sasham, that is, the Pentateuch of the Old Testament, this has already been applied for a long time. In other words, there is nothing modern about acting like pro-choice braggarts. Pro-choice is a bunch of retarded people from 4,000 years ago. Pro-choice, una manga de retardatarios de hace 4,000 años. And at one point he tells me, well, no. Then we have to work to clean up that brainwashing. Liberalism has the foundations to do it, with respect for the right to life. There is probably no better example than Walter Block on the plane. They can never do that with him. But there are some imbeciles who say, no, he is not conservative, he is against abortion. No, Milei is a true liberal. He is not a murderer who is in favor of the murderer in the mother's womb. The worst thing of all is that these things are told to me by someone who is not liberal, and that an imbecile who calls himself a liberal, an Egyptian liberal, endorses it. But, apart from that, Musk tells me, well, we have to start bringing children into the world. Well, that's fine, I think that's great. And then at home, how are we doing? Then I tell him, well, look, I have children. I have 5. Yes, but the 4-legged ones don't count. So also, Elon Musk tells me in one part of the conversation, look how fabulous. And that explains why it is successful, and that is celebratory, praiseworthy. It says, I get up every morning thinking about what problem I can fix for humanity. Okay, that's the social benefactor we're talking about. That's the successful businessman. So, what I want to say is this. By embracing the ideas of freedom and using technology, you know what? We can recreate paradise on Earth. But that paradise on Earth is only going to be possible by embracing the ideas of freedom. Thank you very much, and long live freedom, damn it. Long live freedom. Damn it. Long live freedom, damn it.